إذن حقق الأمير إدوارد إنجازا لم يتوقعه أحد على الإطلاق، والطريقة التي فعل بها ذلك تكاد تكون أكثر إثارة للاهتمام من الإنجاز نفسه. فبالنسبة لتشارلز كان يتصرف لسنوات طويلة وفقا لهذا الافتراض، وهو افتراض غريب حقا، إذ اعتقد أنه بصفته ملكا.
She had always known that a crown is easy to give and hard to take back, and in the final months of her reign, Queen Isolde often made certain that one gift, at least, would never be undone. The Duchy of Rothermere had belonged to her husband, Prince Aldric, for nearly 60 years, worn like a second skin, and when he died she was not going to let it dissolve into the abstract machinery of the crown. It would go to their youngest son, Prince Corin, the one who had never chased headlines, never embarrassed the family, never needed to be managed. That was the plan, and in the spring before her death, it became law. The new king, her eldest son Aldous, stood beside her and signed the instrument that made Corin the Duke of Rothermere. Photographs were taken. The public applauded a tidy, dignified succession. And if a story had ended there, this would be a short and unremarkable tale. But a dukedom, as Queen Isolde understood better than anyone, is not just a name. It is buildings, land, income, and above all it is Hallowgate, the ivy-strangled manor that had served as the ducal seat since before anyone could remember why. Hallowgate was not simply where Corin lived. It was what made the title real. And in her last winter, frail but sharper than anyone gave her credit for, Isolde had a private letter drawn up and witnessed crucially, by Aldric himself in the final week of his own life, stating that Hallowgate was to remain bound to the Rothermere title for as long as Corin held it. She did not do this because she distrusted her eldest son. She did it because she understood institutions. And she understood that institutions forget their promises the moment the person who made them is no longer in the room to enforce them. King Aldous did not set out to be the villain of this story. He believed, sincerely, that a modern monarchy needed a leaner one. Fewer estates sitting half-used, fewer arrangements nobody quite remembered the logic of, more of the family's holdings under central stewardship, where they could be audited, maintained, and justified to a public that increasingly asked why a family of this size needed quite so much house. It was a reasonable position, on paper. Reasonable positions, however, have a way of landing hardest on the people who did nothing to deserve them, and by the third year of his reign, a quiet internal review of royal properties had put a red flag next to Hallowgate. Here is what that review conveniently declined to dwell on. When Corin was offered Hallowgate in his 20s, decades before the dukedom was ever his, it was not the jewel of the family's holdings. It was a wreck. The roof leaked into 4 of its 4 wings. The heating had not been properly serviced since the previous century. The Crown's own property office had drawn up plans at one point to convert it into a conference hotel, because keeping it as a residence made no financial sense. Corin took it anyway, on a lease that gave him the estate for a token rent in exchange for a binding promise. He would restore it fully at his own expense. He did. Over the following years, he spent nearly the entirety of a private inheritance from his mother's side of the family, money that had nothing to do with the crown, rewiring, replastering, re-roofing, and rebuilding a house that the institution itself had been ready to sell off. When the restoration was finished, his rent was renegotiated upward to full market value, confirmed independently by the National Accounts Office. He had turned a liability into an asset using his own money, and then paid the crown handsomely for the privilege of living in what he'd built. Compare that to his older brother Prince Manfred, who occupied a different family property for over a decade at a rate everyone privately acknowledged was a fraction of its worth, and never restored so much as a window frame. The accounts office noted the discrepancy in a report nobody outside the family ever saw. One brother had paid every bill and asked for nothing. The other had paid almost nothing and never been asked to account for it. And now it was the first brother's house that the Crown's Modernization Committee had circled in red ink, because Hallowgate, fully restored, sat on land now worth an amount that made property lawyers whistle. If the Crown reclaimed it, it could be leased or sold for a sum that would fund the entire royal household's public engagements for a decade. The financial logic of taking it back was, from a certain cold angle, impeccable. That was exactly what worried Corin's legal advisors, because impeccable financial logic has never once stopped an institution from doing something shameful. The property dispute might have stayed a private, grinding affair of solicitors' letters, if not for what happened to Corin's wife, Duchess Wren, 6 weeks earlier. Wren had never been the most photographed member of the family, and she had never wanted to be. She occupied a quieter role, and the one true symbol she had ever been given, a tiara commissioned specially for her wedding, built from 4 antique clasps that had belonged to a long-dead royal ancestor, reworked into a design of climbing thornflower, was the only significant jewel she had worn in 20 years of public life. She had never been offered the grander state pieces reserved for the more prominent branches of the family, and she had never asked. The thornflower tiara was hers, given outright by Queen Isolde before her death, and for 2 decades nobody had questioned it. Then a letter arrived from the office of Queen Seraphine, Aldous' wife, framed as a routine heritage audit. The language was careful, bureaucratic, entirely without warmth. Because the tiara incorporated antique elements originally drawn from crown-adjacent stones, the letter suggested, it might properly be classified as an asset of the institution rather than a personal gift, something to be held centrally and issued only for official occasions, rather than owned outright by the woman who had worn it at her own wedding. On its face, this was a legal technicality. In practice, everyone in that family understood exactly what it meant. It meant asking permission to wear the one thing that had ever truly belonged to her. It meant a slow erosion dressed up as paperwork. Wren's advisors moved fast because they had learned, watching how the family's fortunes rose and fell over the years, that slowness was how these things were allowed to happen. They produced a deed, signed by Isolde in the year of the wedding, stating in plain language that the tiara was a private gift, not a loan, not held in trust, not subject to review. Hers, absolutely and for good. Isolde had also personally awarded Wren the Order of the Garnet Star, an honor reserved for those the monarch chose to recognize directly, not through committee. Taken together, it was not just a piece of jewelry the Queen had left behind. It was a Queen's considered, documented statement about a daughter-in-law she had trusted completely, and Seraphine's audit was asking the institution to quietly contradict a dead woman's clearly expressed wishes. There was history here, too, ugly history that everyone remembered whether or not they said so aloud. Years earlier, after the tragic and much-mourned death of a different royal wife, a woman the public had adored, whose story still drew a hush in any room where it was mentioned, a piece of her jewelry had been returned to the family vault, reworked, and worn publicly by another family member entirely. The backlash had been immediate and lasting, one of the few moments the institution's popularity had genuinely cratered. Nobody in the family had forgotten it, which was precisely why Corin's lawyers, once the audit letter landed, did not respond with polite legal correspondence alone. They let it be known, through the kind of careful indirect channel that such families use, that Isolde had left behind private letters, real, physical, written in her own hand, expressing not only her wishes for Wren's jewelry, but her unflinching private opinions about Seraphine herself, opinions formed over years of watching her son's marriage and never fully voiced in public. If the tiara claim was not dropped, those letters would find their way into the world. It was not a threat anyone said outright. It did not need to be. Into this quietly detonating situation walked Princess Rowena, the king's younger sister, a woman known throughout the family and the country for 2 things: absolute discipline and an almost complete absence of patience for nonsense. Rowena and Wren had not always been close. For years they kept a polite, formal distance, the kind that exists between relatives who respect each other without particularly seeking each other out. That changed after Aldrich died. In his final year, it was Rowena and Wren who quietly took on the bulk of the caretaking, sitting with him through the long afternoons nobody else had time for, and something between them shifted permanently. At Isolde's funeral, standing together as the procession passed, Wren had reached over and rested a hand briefly on Rowena's arm. Neither of them mentioned it afterward. They didn't need to. So when Rowena requested a private audience with her brother the king, she did not come as a neutral party. She came, unmistakably, to defend what her mother had already decided, and she did not waste time getting to the point. She told Aldous plainly that if he allowed private, documented gifts from their mother to be picked apart, reclassified, or clawed back one by one, then the crown's word, any king's word, including his own, would cease to mean anything at all. And then she said the thing that reportedly ended the conversation's pretense of civility, that if their mother's signature on a deed could be argued away 20 years after she signed it, then his own signature would be worth even less in 20 years' time, because everyone watching would have learned exactly how little such signatures were worth once the person who made them was gone. She had done her homework on Hallowgate too, and made clear she was not treating the house and the tiara as separate arguments. They were, in her telling, the same fight wearing two faces. Both were things their mother had given outright, in writing, and both were now being circled by the same reasoning. That anything given personally could later be reabsorbed if the institution decided it wanted it back badly enough. Rowena reminded her brother, without raising her voice, that once that principle was accepted for one gift, nothing their mother had ever signed would be safe from the same argument, including things Aldous himself had already promised people. There was something else driving Rowena that had nothing to do with contracts. Wren had lost her own mother young, and Isolde had, in her own undemonstrative way, filled some of that gap over the decades, not loudly, but consistently, in the small accumulated gestures that build real trust. Rowena, who had lost both her father and her mother within 18 months of each other, understood exactly what it meant to watch the last physical traces of a parent's care get picked apart by people who had never earned the right to question them. She had also watched years before as another woman in the family, beloved by the public, gradually isolated by the institution itself, had her support stripped away piece by piece until there was nothing left holding her up. She recognized the shape of what was happening now, even if the details were different, and she was not willing to watch it happen twice. She did not stop at argument. She told her brother, in terms that left no room for misreading, that if Seraphine did not withdraw the audit, she would personally request a full and public accounting of a queen's household spending, not a summary, but a genuine line-by-line audit, the kind nobody in that family had faced in living memory. It was not an idle threat. Rowena had spent 30 years building a reputation for exactly this kind of discipline, and everyone in the family knew that when she said she would do something, she did it. She raised, too, the quiet pressure that had been applied to push Corin and Wren's two teenage children out of their protected status earlier than planned, ostensibly to streamline the family's public footprint. Rowena made clear that decision belonged to the children's parents and to no one else, least of all to a queen consort with no standing to make it. By the time she left the room, King Aldous understood that he had backed himself into a position with no comfortable exit. Overrule his sister's argument and side with his wife's audit, and he would be seen, inside the family and eventually, inevitably outside it, as a monarch willing to unpick his own mother's written wishes to consolidate power and cash. Concede, and he would be seen as unable to control his own household, his authority publicly checked by his sister and his brother within 3 years of his reign beginning. There was no clean version of this that left him looking strong. His own legal counsel, reviewing the full file a week later, delivered news that settled the matter more thoroughly than any argument could. The Hallowgate lease was airtight, the restoration spending was documented to the last invoice, and the letter binding the estate to the dukedom, witnessed by Aldrich in his final days, created an obligation the crown could not unilaterally dissolve without triggering a legal fight it was likely to lose in open court, publicly, humiliatingly. The tiara deed was equally unambiguous. Whatever Seraphine's audit had hoped to establish, the paperwork simply did not support it, and pressing the claim further would only invite exactly the scrutiny the family least wanted. The retreat, when it came, was handled the way these things always are, quietly through a short administrative notice rather than any acknowledgement of what had actually happened. The tiara would remain in the Duchess's private possession, full stop. The property review of Hallowgate was closed, described in the official language as a recognition of the Rothmere household's exceptional stewardship of the estate, a phrase that fooled absolutely no one inside the palace walls. Nothing had changed on paper, except that the crown's early ambitions had quietly evaporated, leaving no trace but the fact that everyone now knew exactly how far the institution had been willing to go, and exactly how close it had come to losing. What lingered was not the outcome but the residue. The relationship between Aldous and his brother was never quite the same afterward, correct, functional, entirely without warmth. The two of them standing together at public engagements, as duty required, while everyone who mattered understood what lay beneath the surface. Two informal centers of gravity had formed within the family. The king and queen consort pursuing their vision of a smaller, tightly managed monarchy, and at a careful distance, Corin, Ren, and Rowena, quietly protected in turn by others who had watched the whole affair and drawn their own conclusions about where their loyalties belonged. The children, older now, would carry that lesson forward whether anyone meant them to or not, that what an institution gives, it may also try to take back, and that the paper trail matters more than the promise. It does not make people disloyal. It makes them careful. And in a family like that one, careful is very often what survives.